works. Like as a presenter, some of you I imagine are going to be either be candidates, you're going to be campaign managers, you're going to be campaign operatives. At some point in time, you're going to be speaking. And almost everyone, 80–90% of people surveyed, hate the sound of their voice, and I am one of them. So I just wanted to let you know that you are not alone in that, okay? But for those of you who don't know me, and I see a couple friendly faces, but for those who don't know me, I'm Avery Murdie. I'm a social scientist and a data analyst. I'm the president of the Georgia Institute for Transitional Justice, and I have been the campaign manager for a House special election and for the State House special election and the State House general election. But I've also been a consultant and strategist for campaigns as small as like Board of Election and Commission. I've been on a consultant for mayoral races, for state senate races, and I've actually been a consultant for several congressional races. You can lead a horse to water, that doesn't mean you can make them drink. So I present my information, and what you do with it is up to you. Now with that, it is getting warm, so I apologize. I'm going to go ahead and get started. This training here, I guess I started at the beginning of. So there were several people who had signed up. They're not actually here, and they've seen me before, and that actually could be maybe one of the reasons why they signed up, and maybe they are running late or not here. So there were a bunch of people who had signed up who had seen my last training in May. Well, I guess I don't really need this note then because it's going to be brand new to you guys, but I wanted to let you know that every time I do a training, I don't regurgitate the information. In fact, it's created brand new, up to date for you. So if you have seen me before, this is going to be a new training. And if I'm going to offer one again in the future, it will be a new training. And the reason for this is simple. I want to continue to provide current, applicable information for you as best as possible. Now, the slides will have more text than a normal presentation. I understand that. I apologize in advance, but I want you to know why. That's because I create all of my content so that it can be shared and referred back to later by each of you. So if you want to, at the end of this presentation, I'll have my contact email address. If you would like a copy of this, just reach out to me. I'll provide it to you. And there's going to be a whole lot we're not going to cover. So if at any point you have questions about something, specific questions to your race, you can reach out to me. I'll be more than happy to help you. All right, so here's a quick overview of what we're going to do today. Most modern Democratic campaigns really are actually behind the times when it comes to what actually makes a successful campaign. In fact, this whole idea of using data and research was inspired, or I guess initiated, by Republicans at the turn of the century, early 2000s. So at the beginning of the aughts, the Republicans were losing a lot, and they said, we need to revolutionize the way that we're doing things. And they actually came up with this brilliant plan, as simple as it is. We need to start at the local level and work our way up. And that's exactly what they've done. Democrats have taken the local campaigns for granted. They thought that the presidential was really what mattered. But it doesn't matter if you have a president in there that's to your party if neither House of Congress is going to get anything passed that you want. All right, so throughout this campaign, there's a couple things that we want to try and cover. We're going to look at a lot of campaigns start way too early, and they have no idea of what a good timeline is. Most people are like, hey, I'm a candidate, and then they feel like they have to go to everything and tell people, vote for me 2 years in advance. Using logic versus an emotional appeal. I am guilty of this. I would assume several of you in here, since you are here and want to learn more, are probably guilty of this as well, but there's this really easy, I guess, push inside each of us that if we can just convince them, if we can just give them the facts, we will win them over. And that is absolutely not true. Which voters to target? A lot of people think, I need every vote. I need every vote. And while that statement's not wrong, you need every vote you can get. And there's a difference between every vote out there and every vote you can get. You need to be targeting the correct individuals. Which campaign tactics are efficient? There are a million different things that your campaign can do throughout the course of your campaign, and that doesn't mean that they're going to be effective, optimal. In fact, some things actually backfire and are worse than if you had done nothing at all. This is a very, I did this on Google Slides so I could share it. Sometimes when you put it on or convert it to PowerPoint, it kind of messes up the fonts. My apologies. Simplified view of field strategy. Really, all you need to do is understand the electorate. You need to identify and target your voters and then employ your strategy. Overly simplified, I think we all know that. But I point this out because each of you in here are going to be a part of some varying level of race, maybe local like board or commission, maybe larger state house, state senate, or even congressional. The basic ideas, the fundamentals are going to be the same, but the tactics that you employ, maybe the strategies that you use might be a little bit different. So you need to take the research that I'm going to give you and you need to apply it specifically with nuance to your race. Now, if you are the candidate or campaign manager, and this is just an example slide of what we're going to go over, this is actually a true factoid. Sincerity matters, I think we all know that, but ironically, don't try to be humble. It's called humble bragging, and we have research on this. I'm guilty of it, I'll give you an example. Here's humble bragging. Let's say I know Andrea, so if you don't mind, I'm going to use this. So Andrea sees me on the street. She's like, "Oh man, I saw," because I'm a candidate. I'm running for, let's just say, U.S. Senate. She's like, "I saw your quarterly report, like your financial campaign disclosure. Like you raked in a ton of money." And what I do is I go, "Oh yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. We still have a lot of work to do. We could do better. My opponent, pulled in a lot more. So." We're working on it. So what I did there is I took a compliment and I acknowledged it with this little bit of a boast, like, yeah, we pulled in a lot. But I tried to backpedal and be humble, add a little bit of humility to it, like, oh, it's, my opponent pulled in more type of. That bragging paired with either a complaint or a little bit of humility is actually a terrible thing to do. Because people see it as insincere, and they see you then as less trustworthy. And I know that seems counterintuitive, so there's actually two ways you should handle that. When there is something good about you or your campaign, or somebody mentions something about you, you should either straight up own it and brag, as they say, or actually complain. Like, yeah, but we didn't get enough, man. Seriously, those outcomes actually are perceived better by the receiver of the message than trying to be humble. So, I mention this because we have candidates in here, we have campaign managers, and it's going to happen to you. People are going to be complimenting you throughout the campaign. You did a good job, this was a great speech, whatever. You just need to straight up own it and be sincere and like, yep, thank you, I appreciate that. Otherwise, they will see you as insincere and less trustworthy. Now, you probably can't read it, I get that, but when this is shared, you also have access to this. Throughout my entire presentation, the studies that I'm referencing or citations, I put examples. It's not an exhaustive list. There's actually a million studies out there, but I've put representative samples of studies and citations so that if this is something, let's say you doubt me, you want to go back and check, or maybe you want to learn more about it, you can do that. All right, the truth about voters and elections. So I think the simplistic view, especially the long-held view historically, is that people have preferences. They know what they want, they care about issues, and they're going to vote for people that are going to represent them on those issues. And if they don't represent them on those issues, they're going to vote them out. Makes sense, but it's all wrong. Politics is actually about mobilizing your voters. You don't actually care about the entire electorate, and you shouldn't, because if you do, you're wasting time and energy, and you're wasting your volunteers' time and energy, and your volunteers are important. In reality, even voters who pay close attention to politics, and this I can't stress enough, the more actively engaged they are, the more biased they are. So, for all of you candidates out there, and for all of you campaign operatives, you're going to have a bunch of people who are showing up like they are your best volunteers, and they're there every weekend, and you depend on them. Your operation wouldn't exist without them. You need them, and that is great. But they are also going to be the most biased, the most opinionated, and they're going to have this is the way it should be done. And you go, yep, thank you, I appreciate that, and then you keep doing what you need to do. It's just the way that it is. The reason is simple, though. Most people make political decisions on the basis of social identities and partisan loyalties, not an honest examination of reality. And this is bore out by study after study after study. Voters adjust their policy views and even their perceptions of basic matters of fact to match these loyalties. So in other words, they've got a worldview, and if the facts don't fit their worldview, they're going to make them fit their worldview. Voters adjust their policy views and even their perceptions of basic matters of fact to match those loyalties. Here's an example of what I mean by that. So look, given the history of the US and Russia, Cold War and everything, the whole like KBG and the movies that we've made, you would actually think that most Americans today have a fairly negative view of Russia. But the reality is, for a large segment of the US, those beliefs about Russia and the Soviets, the old Soviets, they changed very dramatically and very quickly. They got their messages from someone they trusted. They got them from their parents, their grandparents, from their pastors, right? They got them from their boss. And then what they did is they were happy to change their worldview because, one, they were partisan, they had loyalty to the party, and the facts weren't matching. And they also trust the authority figures that we're getting this new information from. So based off of those two primary things, the fact that they trusted the person they're getting the information from and the facts weren't matching, so they weren't comfortable with that, they simply adjusted the facts to match their worldview, and now they're happy. That's why they continue to support the GOP and Trump. So voters are good at picking people who appear to be on their side, who play the right rhetorical game. I don't think I really need to go into detail about Trump and all the rhetoric that he's used. He is exceptionally good. If nothing else, he is extremely good at being racist and sexist and xenophobic and whatever else, because a lot of his base likes that rhetoric. They're picking up on it. He uses dog whistles 24/7, and in fact, he's even more brazen. Half the time, he doesn't use dog whistles. He just straight up says it. And for those of you who are going to be involved in nonpartisan races, this is actually why partisan cues matter. In nonpartisan races, you really need to make sure that you actually have partisan cues. So some of you might say, okay, but wait a minute, there are moderates, independents, undecideds, we call these swing voters. There's swing voters out there that we can go get. And those individuals, at least, right, I can win them over. Well, the short answer is no. And the longer answer is not really. All right, again, I don't know why. It shows up fine on the laptop, but we were looking at this earlier, the projector, so I apologize. You're just going to have to bear with me, okay? Marriage is actually important because when you go to Canvas, when you are text messaging, when you're sending out mailers, and this is all going to come in, it's going to tie in later, but marriage is important because there's something called a spillover effect. You don't have to reach all the voters in a household or even in a family. If you can reach one of them, there's a spillover effect where that information and likelihood to register to vote or to vote actually propagates through that person's close social network. But there's an interesting twist to this. So only 6% of married Republican males are married to Democratic women. And only 3% of married Democratic males are married to Republican women. Right off the bat, you can tell people of opposite parties, they hate each other so much, they're not even willing to get married, if you have different political views. That's how partisan things are right now. So, the same party marriages, though, when you have a Democrat-Democrat or Republican-Republican, they're actually the most likely voters to go out and vote, and canvassing, texting, communications with one member spills over to the other. So if you talk to the Democratic wife, you don't have to talk to the Democratic husband. She will do it for you. However, mixed party marriages, and I don't mean just Democrat-Republican, I also mean Democrat-Independent, so this is important to realize. That spillover effect doesn't really occur anymore. So in that particular case, you would need to reach a larger network of individuals. Now, partisans differ on virtually every issue. I'm bringing this up because there is this idea that, I just need to hammer home these issues. Let's talk about healthcare, let's talk about jobs, let's talk about this or that. The truth is that what we think is important, so this graph over here was supposed to represent what our national priorities should be. And there is quite a gap between some of these. Some are fairly close, but look at some of these gaps. It won't surprise you, this one's the environment. But like climate change, the military, here's climate change. There's a huge gap between what Democrats consider important and what Republicans consider important. So if you're out there talking about issues to your base, climate change and healthcare, and those issues Republicans don't really care about at all. Again, the colors didn't show up. Here's the point, 1999, 2019. It went from a 14-point gap to a 19-point gap. That's the average difference in what people consider are important policies. But more importantly, the largest gap between any issue went from 24 points to 46 points, almost doubled. What people consider important issues keep getting further and further apart. So that's what I'm trying to get at here. So if you have this idea that your campaign can win people over by hammering home issues, it's not going to work the way you think it is. It'll work for your base, and that's why you need to tailor the message of whatever you have about this issue to your base. Don't try to water it down to appease these so-called moderates or to try and win over Republicans or something. Because that issue that you're talking about to your base, the Republicans don't care about. So if they don't care about it, go all in on your base. In fact, I do want to point out here, if we go back to 1994, education was the #1 issue nationally for Democrats and Republicans. Education is still the #2 issue for Democrats now, but education isn't even in the top 5 anymore for Republicans. So if your campaign is talking about education, whether you're like Board of Education or Commission or State Senate, it's just not on the minds of Republicans. So if that's the case, go all in on your base about education. So let's be clear about 3 things, please. Moderates are a myth. Independents are partisan. They just don't want you to know. And people aren't undecided. They actually do pick a party, and they pick relatively soon. So the moderate middle is a myth because only 2.4%, less than 3% of the entire electorate can actually be considered truly undecided, moderate, independent, people you can win over because they're wishy-washy. 1, that's a ridiculously small number, and 2, we also know they're the least likely to register to vote and the least likely to actually vote. So if there's such a small group, and if they're not likely to vote, why are you going to waste a lot of time trying to hunt them down? While some individuals might be a little more moderate than others, look, we know that's true. Even within the Democratic Party, there's a wide range of where people stand ideologically. But while they tend to be more moderate, they have a partisan preference. And they will still vote the party line in 9 out of 10 cases. And while others might be a little more independent, they've already decided who they're going to vote for long before Election Day. All right, this, in a nutshell, is just simply this. Independents, moderates, undecideds. When we've polled individuals nationally, and then we've got each quadrant represents kind of a quadrant on an ideological spectrum, conservative, libertarian, independent. Independent would be the very middle. More liberal. What we see is that people who say they're independent are ridiculously all over the place. Which means that if you do actually decide to hunt down independents and try to win them over, are you hunting down and actually targeting the more liberal crowd, or are you engaging with the more conservative crowd and thus mobilizing them to vote against you? That's a risky thing to think about here. You could potentially be motivating people to vote who are going to oppose you. So this is why it's probably better. I'm going to move over here for you, Chris. This is why it's probably better to avoid the independents, because you're just as likely, seriously like 50-50, you're just as likely to activate the opposition than you are to activate anybody who's going to support you. Now, you might say, okay, but I've seen a billion polls. They all say that there are a ton of independents out there, and that's true. This actually comes from Pew Research here, and 38% of the electorate, more than people who say they're Republican, more than people who say they're Democrats, 38% say, I'm an independent. That's what they tell you, because people don't like for their political affiliations to be known, because a lot of people really feel bad about it. They don't want to deal with the hassles of their neighbors, whatever the case is. I think you all can understand that. When we look at voting records and exit polls, and when we look at them over time, we find out that truly only about 7% of the electorate are actually independent. The vast majority have a preference, and they continue every election to vote that party. So this is important. I know we've kind of touched on it briefly, and I know you're probably going to be like, okay, we get it. I hope you get it. But I want to keep hammering home this point because I have met with dozens and dozens, in fact, I've probably met with a dozen campaigns in the last 3 months, 2 months. And several of them have still expressed interest or this idea of trying to win over moderate Republicans because they think they're tired of Trump, they can win them over. So if there's any of you in here, I am just going to be straight up honest about it, you're wrong. Plain and simple. It's not going to happen. And one reason is because partisanship can actually alter memory. What party you belong to can actually change the way you recall events having happened. In other words, two partisan voters, Democrat and Republican, thinking back about let's use the Monica Lewinsky and Clinton incident, they're going to remember events about that differently. And this can explain why people place party loyalty over policy, even truth. So, for example, in one study, when they changed the false beliefs about a political candidate, it didn't actually change the evaluation. So they were able to get a few partisans to change their beliefs, like to acknowledge change in fact, but that still didn't change the level of support for that candidate, which is surprising. So, for instance, correcting erroneous positive beliefs about Donald Trump was sufficient to shatter those beliefs. So they actually did get across to them like, that's not true. The people are like, all right, you got me. But it didn't change their level of support for him. I don't get it. How can you be like, okay, yeah, you're right, you're wrong, but I'm still going to vote for that dude? This underscores that the distortion of beliefs is just one element of political preference. Now, maybe you can't win them over, but you can suppress Republican votes. So you want to mobilize your base, you want to suppress the opposition. By the way, fairness arguments don't even go there, it doesn't work, and partly, we're going to get to this in a second, but it's because the language that we use, the actual terminology, the definitions are different. I'm going to get to that in a second. Trump has repeatedly behaved disloyalty towards our country to serve his own interests. That's the type of statement that can demobilize the opposition. They're not going to vote for you, but they're not as energetic to go vote in the first place because you're attacking their core values. Republicans and conservatives really love loyalty, they love patriotism. So when you are basically hitting those values that they really, really hinge on, it just brings them down a level and you get a few less who would otherwise vote. Arguments opposing Trump that appeal to the more conservative value of loyalty were more effective, and in the end, fewer people voted, just by simply hitting those values of loyalty. The polarized electorate, 1994, so these are Republicans on the top. 64% of Republicans were more conservative relative to the median Democrat. Fast forward today, 92% of Republicans are more conservative than the median Democrat. They're shifting right, relatively speaking. And in terms of Democrats, it is fuzzy here. I think it was actually like 70% of Democrats were more liberal than the median Republican, relatively speaking. Fast forward today, 94% of Democrats are more liberal than the median Republican. So what we're seeing are these gigantic shifts that are occurring where conservatives are becoming more conservative and liberals are becoming more liberal. There really isn't any middle ground, and I can't stress that enough. That's why I keep saying it. All right, all this means here is that 2008 to 2019, just in the past 10 years, the Democratic base has been wanting to become more liberal. And crazily enough, the Republicans have been consistently really wanting to go more conservative in the last 10 years. So they are dead set on going more conservative, and Democrats are wanting to be more liberal. So if you're running a campaign, if you're a candidate, you just need to face reality, whoever you are ideologically, and accept the fact that Democrats want to be more liberal. Embrace it. You might say, but wait a minute. Aren't there still more Democrats that want to be moderate than liberal? Well, again, the liberal portion is growing. And two, okay, so what if a few Democrats want to be moderate? The vast majority, 2 and 3 Republicans, don't, by any stretch of the imagination. They want to be conservative. So it still doesn't matter. They're going to vote party line. We know that 92 to 96% of the time, they're going to vote straight down the ticket for Republican, straight down the ticket for Democrat. The down ballot voting. This is just what I was talking about. 9 in 10 Democrats will vote for every Democrat. They don't even have to know the people. They just see a D behind their name. Yep, yep, yep. Same thing with Republicans. They just see an R and they just vote straight down the ticket. If you are one of the smaller races, you want to take advantage of this. But there are two things that happen. There's ballot fatigue, where individuals who, let's say that there are a whole bunch of ballot initiatives, or a whole bunch of people, on there. If that thing is like a mile long, people actually stop filling it out, and they just turn it in. Most people in a general election show up to vote for the candidate of their choice at the top of the ticket, whether it was Stacey Abrams in 2018 or whether it was Hillary Clinton in 2016. That's why they're there to vote. They're not there to vote for the state house. They don't know who their state senator is. That's not a concern to them. They want the president. And then as long as they're okay-ish, comfortable, they'll keep filling it out. But eventually, we see huge numbers of people go, all right, well, that's good enough for me. I got stuff to do. Maybe they have kids there with them. Maybe they've been waiting in a long line forever, like an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours. They're tired. Maybe it's raining. By the way, rain is terrible for Democrats on election day. Republicans show up in greater numbers when it rains. Democrats don't. So you can't control the weather, but that's just something to think about here, because that will actually affect Democratic numbers. This is why you really want to get people to early vote to try and offset anything the weather might do on election day. But let me give you an example of this ballot fatigue here. I think it was like 2016 in Clarke County. There was a 30% drop, like around a 30% drop in the number of people in Clarke County who voted for governor, but, Clinton. There was a 30% drop in the number of people who voted for Clinton as to the insurance commissioner. So in other words, there were 30% of the voters who went in, voted for Hillary in 2016 in Clarke County, and were like, insurance commissioner, I don't know who the heck that is, so they just skipped it. They just skipped marking out that box completely. So they either turned in an incomplete ballot, or they didn't know much information about that race, so they just skipped it and moved on. We see that all the time. It's a real phenomenon. If you are lower on the ballot, if you're a down ballot race, you run the risk of people ignoring your particular race. So you want to tie your campaign to the top. And when you're out there contacting voters, you want to continuously encourage them. Hey, we are glad that would you mind telling me, who would you be okay with being the Democratic presidential candidate this year? Name me 3 people.
Warren or Sanders.
Okay, Warren's first. Let's just go with that. Warren's on the ballot, okay? So I'm coming here and I'm going to talk to her and I'm like, hey, great, you've been a great voter. Thank you. I appreciate it. By the way, your garden is fantastic. Are those sunflowers? How do you get them to grow? I'm going to get to this in a minute. The actual message of the conversation doesn't matter. And then I'm going to be like, we really hope that you come out and vote again. And we hope that you vote for Warren and Avery. We hope that you vote for Warren and Avery. Remember, Warren and Avery, yay! You want to tie yourself to the top because it works and it helps reduce ballot fatigue and ballot drop-off for your race. How bad is the partisan divide? I put this in here because I thought you guys might like it since Thanksgiving is coming up. The partisan divide is actually bad enough to cut Thanksgiving dinner short with relatives. So there was a study done, fascinating. I love research. Seriously. Using smartphone geolocation, they could actually, and precinct data in places where people did have registered party affiliations, we could actually track people leaving to go to relatives for Thanksgiving. And what we noticed is that if they were going to similarly registered relatives, the dinners lasted longer. When they were going to houses or locations where there were cross-party affiliations, the dinners were shorter. And it was Republicans who were shortening dinner the most. So my point here is if Republicans can't even get along with their own family, seriously, folks, I feel like Gordon Ramsay up here. What are you doing? What are you thinking? If Republicans can't get along with their family, do you really think you're going to win them over? All right. Even when they don't like them, they're still going to vote for them. We're spending a lot of time here discussing this, and again, I can't emphasize how important this is. You just need to embrace the fact that you have to go all in. That with the more extreme you go, progressive or conservative, then it mobilizes the opposition. So this is a careful calculus your campaign has to make. Let's say, I don't know, what the most probably extreme things on the left right now that the right considers extreme are universal health care, maybe a federal job guarantee. Can somebody give me one more thing?
Universal basic income.
Okay, let's go with it. Oh yeah, they'll love that, you socialists. So let's go with universal basic income, okay? Those three things right there. That might really energize your base, but it's also going to elevate the number of people on the opposition who are going to turn out to vote against you because you're a commie. Now, usually we see that as a wash because let's say you increase your base by 2-3%, and maybe that increased the opposition by 2-3%. So that's a wash, didn't really make a whole lot of difference. But you never know how that's going to go. What if you only increase your base by 2%, but you increase theirs by 4%? It could be enough in a close election to defeat you, right? So it's a calculus you're going to have to make. Do you think that you can really go all in on that, or do you just need to kind of back off on the rhetoric just a little bit? That's going to be up to each one of you. So this is an actual quote from somebody who says that they hate Donald Trump, and then it's like, this person, Burl, voted for him as a loyal Republican and under pressure from a sister who is deeply hostile to Hillary Clinton. They said, and I quote, "I voted the least of two evils." Now, I hate when people say that, but that's what they said. I voted the least of two evils. Behind the scenes, I know who they're going to vote for, but people don't want to say that they're for Trump. They're embarrassed, too. I'm embarrassed sometimes with things he says and how he says them. So this person's a substitute teacher. So they've admitted. They've just straight up said, yeah, the guy he's creepy, he's a pervert, he's made mistakes, he's embarrassing. I don't want anybody to know I support him. They'll admit that. And yet, she's already gearing up to repeat Trump's victory. This person is the chair of their county's Republican Party. So the chair of this Republican Party says Trump's embarrassing, but they're still going to vote for him. How do you reconcile that? You can't. You need to focus on your base. All right, I told you earlier. So Republicans and Democrats have different definitions of corruption, patriotism, and American. Language is a barrier. So if you're trying to have a conversation with somebody, whether it's a voter or whether you're in an interview as a candidate, you're at a forum, whatever the case is, the words that we're using don't have the same meaning we think they do to all recipients. I'll give you a good one here, corruption. So, sir, would you mind giving me, what do you think corruption is? Now we say Trump's a corrupt president, right? So what do you think we mean by that?
Using power to promote your personal interests.
All right. Would you agree with that? All right, so we got some fair amount of agreement in here. We see it as an abuse of power, right? But ironically, that's not how Republicans see it. Republicans actually have a different view of what corruption is. By that I mean they actually see corruption as a corruption of purity, as a corruption of their values and the way that things should be. This is why, do you guys remember the phrase like corrupt Hillary, crooked Hillary? Mm-hmm. She wasn't crooked because of abuse of... How many Democrats were like, no, that's not true, oh, the Benghazi thing. Like they just went over all this stuff trying to defend her like she's not corrupt or crooked. But they were all barking up the wrong tree because they were all making an argument that didn't have anything to do with what Republicans were actually talking about. One, they were talking about gender norms. Men run for higher positions of office, not women. Hillary was violating that norm by running for the highest office in the country, running for president. That was a corruption of gender norms. When we talk about equality, so when we talk about gender rights, when we talk about racial rights and racial justice, and when we're talking about these types of things, to us it's about equality and fairness. To Republicans, it's a corruption of the way things should be. So I point this out because you aren't going to win over a debate when you're using language that you don't understand how they're perceiving it. They see things differently than you, and their definitions for words are different than the ones that you have. So Democrat and Republican participants, so in this study, to give you a clear example of this, what they did is they brought in partisans, Democrats, Republicans, and they gave them the exact same article. Article had a story about some political candidate or some political event. Same story. And they evaluated the feelings, the way that the partisans thought about that story. Exact same information. And what they found is that the two groups made opposite evaluations. Probably not surprising, I guess. But the articles were perceived as more negative by Republicans, were perceived as less negative, so more favorable by Democrats. They just see the same information in completely opposite ways. Furthermore, there was a strong association between positive perception, and this is the important thing, in-group transmission. Information that was more favorable to their social identity and their belief system, their worldview. They pass that on, and of course, as you all know, we call these like echo chambers, right? So what they did is they actually gave them this information, and they discovered within their social network that when they agreed with a story, or it was favorable to their worldview, they were more than happy to spread that information on, and it continued to carry on. And that includes misinformation for Republicans, and it includes favorable information for Democrats. So when we talked earlier about the spillover effect, talking to one spouse in the house and it goes over to the others, information, whether they get it off Facebook, whether you're running advertisements on Facebook or social media, flyers, favorable information that a Democrat likes and fits with their worldview, they're likely to pass that on in their social networks, and you need to take advantage of that. All right, the Republicans are not going to accept someone who is more moderate than them. So in the 2018 midterms, when we look at like House Republican incumbents that were in pretty safe districts, this was a case where 23 out of the 30 Republican incumbents lost, and those 30 lost, but the 23 out of 30 who lost were more moderate than the person who won. So conservatives are winning. They're rejecting moderates. If you can't get the theme of this, we need to have a long chat afterwards. Republicans in Georgia back Trump. What are they saying? This is in Georgia locally. So this is from the HAC. They interviewed some people. They want results over resistance. The people of America are fed up with this. People in Georgia want Congress to work. Why can't we all just get along? The impeachment thing started before Donald Trump put his hand on the Bible. So it doesn't actually matter like what information is coming out now for the impeachment. In their mind, remember when we talked earlier about it can alter memory? In their minds, the impeachment started long before all this Ukraine stuff came out. Democrats have been looking for any excuse they could find, no matter how baseless or ridiculous, to impeach the president. It's outrageous, disgusting, let's do something about it. Not a single prominent Republican in the state of Georgia has come out against Trump. Here's what I want you to get from all of this, okay? The Republican voters at the local level follow their local leaders. And the local leaders follow the state leaders, and the state leaders follow the federal leaders. Everything is tied to the federal level. Everything is tied to the federal level, and you need to understand that. I don't know the size of all the races some of you are in, but it's tied to the federal level. Why are we discussing national politics and the training for state and local offices? Because increasingly United States, everything is tied to the national level. Now candidates running for state offices are better off. We actually know, so empirically, we know that individuals running for state offices, state house, state senate, gubernatorial, they're actually more likely to win their races when they tie themselves to their party's top candidate. Hey Athens, you're actually in a book about politics. And oddly enough, it actually fits in perfectly with this discussion. So, quote from it, even those studies that do analyze states and localities frequently conceive of them as independent polities, more like ancient Athens than Athens, Georgia. But this is a key takeaway. It's also a mistake to treat state and local politics as independent and autonomous. You can't sit in here and go, well, I'm a Board of Education race, I'm a commission race, I'm just a small town mayoral race. It doesn't matter to me. Like, these people only care about the school system here. That's not true. They do care about the school system, so let me reword it. They care about the school system, but they care more about the party. Voters do not react to campaign messages as dispassionate observers. They're not logical. It's hard to talk about it this way, but they're emotional, not logical. They are biased partisans. Campaign messages can either mobilize and increase electoral participation, or they can depress turnout. We covered that briefly. We're going to go a little bit more in depth. Negative attack ads don't work. And mostly don't work. There's some caveats. There's nuance to everything. But in a general sense, going negative doesn't work. In fact, quick tip over here. So negativity in Democratic primaries hurts the attacker more than the target. Now, I don't know if any of you are going to have a primary opposition, but if you do, while I would highly encourage you not to go negative in general, definitely do not go negative in your primary. That will cost you many votes, because Democrats are sensitive to this, and I know the term is like snowflake. I don't like to use that word, but I don't have a better expression off the top of my head. Democrats like level playing fields. They like the ideal that democracy should work a certain way. And negativity doesn't play into that. Negativity seems underhanded and it seems dirty. And so Democratic primary voters punish the Democratic candidate who does that, who goes negative. So don't do it. If negativity did work so well, every campaign would just straight up go negative, and the most negative campaign would win. There was a review of 111 studies that looked at negativity. And there are some mixed results, because there are some instances where it can win. In fact, it actually works better for Republicans. It doesn't really cost Republicans to go negative, but it does cost Democrats. It does lower the target support. So if I were targeting, again, I'm sorry, I want to keep using Andrea.
You're fine. And I'm not front, so.
So yeah, well, you just happen to be, I don't know if he's for me, so I feel really bad. They're going to leave here like, oh my God, that guy was mean. But let's see her again. She's going to be like, why'd you do that? So if I just keep hammering home like, Andrea is this socialist, whatever, I can actually lower her support. But it's going to lower mine as well. It usually is a net wash in votes, but again, this kind of goes back to like the extremism on the ideology, right? You can actually go extreme and not really be punished by your voters. In fact, you might mobilize a few more of your voters, but you're also going to mobilize a few more of the opposition. How much is hard to say. Same thing with negativity. You can actually suppress some of your opposition's voters, but it's going to suppress some of yours as well. How much is hard to say.
So you're saying within the Democratic, if your opponent is Democratic, like
Well, I'm
you're
saying,
saying primaries.
This isn't overall,
Okay.
like in general, but it's more dramatic in a primary. So it's more pronounced in a primary,
Got it.
but we still see the same thing overall. Good. Oh, by the way, thank you. If you have any questions, this is not a wait till the end. I've got so much information here. If you wait till the end, we're all going to forget. So, like where that was. Oh, I had a question about something. Yes.
Yeah, didn't you previously say extremer positions might activate opposition?
Yep.
Now you're saying extremer positions might gain you more votes.
Yes. Those are both true. So here's what I mean by this. The Democratic Party is a very diverse party. In fact, some experts, there's different ways to kind of categorize different groups, but it's kind of general just to say that there are 6 wings of the Democratic Party. There's only like 3 or 4 of the Republican. There's like 6 in the Democratic. And they do range from a lot more moderate to very progressive. If you try to go a little more extreme and you embrace, you said universal basic income, so let's say that, you embrace universal basic income, you're going to mobilize more of your hardcore progressive individuals. Oh yeah, he believes in the right thing, I'm going to vote for him. But your opposition is going to hear that, and now those voters are going to be like, well, I can't let a social, I wasn't too excited about this race, I don't really care for my candidate, but I definitely don't want a socialist in there, so I'm going to go vote against that person. So it can do both things at once. They can both be true at the same time. It can mobilize your voters and mobilize the opposition. This is where rhetoric comes in. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. You can actually have policy positions, but your rhetoric can excite your base and temper the opposition, the messages that you use. Now, Republicans, again, thank you. If you have any questions, please feel free at any time.
I just have another question about that. Would it depend then on the district? Because
Yep, that is exactly right.
I worked for Lucy McBath like this summer, and I felt like it was like a lot easier for her to be more moderate than it would be for like maybe someone that's running in a different district.
So as I said on like slide 2 or 3, you're going to take this information and you're going to apply it to your race. Because The partisan makeup of the race is different for every race. Plus, the demographics also kind of change which issues are a little more important or how people perceive your rhetoric on issues, okay? Like if I'm in Alpharetta and I'm running a campaign in Alpharetta or Marietta, like the language there is going to be different than the language that's used perhaps in College Park, Atlanta, right? And so it's just, there are just some facts and you've got to work with those. Negativity can actually mobilize the opposition, so that's just what we were talking about. It does slightly lower feelings of political efficacy, trust in government, and possibly overall public mood. So if you actually care at all about a healthy democracy, don't go negative just because the repeated negative nature of messages and ads just make voters, Democrat and Republican, distrust the government even more. And if you're running for government office, that's probably not something you want. Yes, sir.
Is there a way to, like, so before you were saying that Republicans like when you, or it works with them when you make arguments that maybe they're being disloyal to their party or to their country. Is there a way to like make that argument without coming off as like negatively attacking that other candidate?
Thank you so much for bringing that up, because we are going to get to that. So yes, there is a way. So there is a way, and we are shortly going to get to that. All right. So there is risk in letting an attack go unanswered. This doesn't mean, like if somebody, because look, negativity happens. Rumors circulate in a community. Like ugliness, politics is often ugly. It's going to happen. There is risk in letting it go unanswered. In fact, one of the worst things you can do is just ignore it. We're going to get to that. So a better question is, how should you respond when you are the target of negativity? These are some good defenses, and then we'll go over what are not good defenses. Denial. I didn't do that. That's not true. I don't know what they're talking about. That never happened. I know it sounds ridiculous, but it actually works. What it does, in fact, is negativity is going to lower your support. Denial brings it back to what it was before, status quo. So it boosts the defender's vote share, lowers challengers' favorability. And by challenger, I mean the person who's lobbying the negative attack ad. Counter image, positive image, flips attack. Here's what I mean by counter image. So again, Andrea's like, don't vote for Avery. I've seen him around town. He's an alcoholic. I saw him like, he's a party guy out till 3 a.m. He's crazy, man. Up on cars doing weird stuff. Okay. So then what do? My campaign's like, all right, we got to change this image. So now I start running all these ads with my wife and family in the church pew on Sunday. Yep, we're out having a picnic on the grass in a park on a sunny day. And, I'm challenging that image that was lobbed at me, and I'm this wholesome family guy. That's counter image. Again, it brings it back up to the status quo. So it returns to the status quo. Justification. Yeah. So I acknowledge I had a little too much to drink, and I ran over that squirrel. But in my defense, he was staring at me in a very provocative manner, and I did not appreciate that. Justification is just acknowledging the behavior, saying, yep, I did it, taking responsibility, but you're downplaying the yeah, I did it, so what? Like, everybody runs over a squirrel, big deal. Those return your suppressed vote share back to the status quo. What doesn't work? A counterattack. Oh yeah, Andrea lobbed an attack at me, well, I'm going right back at her. That is a terrible thing to do. It causes the most loss of support for the attacker, so it will actually suppress. I'm just going to like, oh, hell yeah, well, I saw her she was like doing all of this, that terrible stuff, man. She was like hunting puppies and everything, terrible. That will cause the most loss of support among her supporters, the people who would vote for her. But it's also going to cost me as well, because they're like, God, can you believe the horrible things that dude is saying about her? So yes, it's going to cost her, but it's also going to cost me. Stay on message. You know that whole ignore it, just stay on message? Well, the stay on message, you are going to take a loss from that attack, and ignoring it is going to cost you votes. It does not return things to the status quo. Accuse the attacker of mudslinging. Andrea is going to be like, Avery is just lobbing ridiculous things at me. Like, he's gone all negative. This is terrible. This is not the way democracy should be. That's mudslinging, like accusing me of mudslinging. That's actually the least the least effective thing you can do, and it costs you the most votes. They see that as a desperate last resort. It must be true, and you've got no defense for it, so you're just going to start yelling and complaining and saying that I'm just this rotten guy. So, denial, counter-image, justification, work to bring things back to the way they were before. Counterattacking, stay on message, accuse attacker mudslinging, lower your support and vote share.
I guess, what's the difference between denial and accusing attacker of mudslinging? Because in the same type of
Okay, well, denial is just so. And I said that she's punting puppies. She's like, that's ridiculous. I have no idea what he's talking about. I didn't do it. That's denial. Mudslinging is, can you believe the horrible things he's saying about me? He's so desperate that he's got to make up all these false accusations against me. So, I don't know. I've got 2 kids. They weren't ever really terrible. They're 17 and 15 now. But when they were teeny tiny, when one does something, the other one runs, and she did this and that and stole my toy and just raking them over the coals.
Right.
Okay, positive messages work the best. Running positive ads can increase a candidate's margin of victory. And there are 2 factors at play here. Candidates must both stay positive and they need to out-advertise their opponent if they want to increase the margin of victory. So those are the 2 main things there. The effects of positive advertising are strongest in areas where the candidate is losing or winning by a lot. Now you might go, well, if I'm losing, what does it matter? Well, you need to make up ground, right, in that precinct that you're losing a lot in. Positive messages flooding that losing precinct will have the most effect at shortening that gap. And if you have 13 precincts in your race, for example, yes, you might lose that precinct overall, but if you're losing it by a wide margin and you flood it with positive ads, you can shrink that margin. You're still not going to win that precinct, but you'll get a larger vote share, and perhaps that vote share is enough to win you, that particular race. On the flip side, if you have a precinct where you're overwhelmingly just crushing your opponent, flood it with positive ads, if you have room for in voter turnout, because there is diminishing returns on voter turnout, only so many people are going to turn out. But if you're at 55%, and historically that precinct's been 70%, you've got room to get more people out there. So flood it with positive messages and increase your margin of victory in that precinct, because overall you might need those votes to win an election if it's a close race. Caveats to messages. They need to be timely, relevant, and truthful. Repetition, repetition, repetition. Hammer home the same message again and again and again. Strong message. Obama's hope, yes we can, change, very simple, very effective, very repetitive, very truthful and timely. Regardless of what you think of Obama as a president, I'm talking about the tactics here, and they were very effective. The message was very effective.
Question from the previous slide. You said that people are strongest in areas where they are losing or winning by a large margin geographically. Does that also apply to policy areas? If you're losing strongly on a specific policy issue, is it stronger to go positive in that rather than negative?
So for instance, in the studies looking at this, they were looking at precincts and looking at vote share. So I'd have to go back and look at the methodology and see if they were actually looking at policy. My gut feeling would be no, since the only thing that they're measuring is vote share.
Okay.
What about going left in a primary and center in general? Has anybody heard of this strategy before? Candidates will go a little more left in the primary, but then they kind of pull it back to the center in a general. Is anybody familiar with that thought, that line of reasoning? All right. So here's what we know about that. Studies show that rhetoric changes, not the policy. Previous candidates, such as Clinton, Obama, and Kerry, they use more extreme language to try and appeal to that more progressive crowd and their group, win that primary, and then they toned down their rhetoric to try and win over what they thought were swing voters and moderates. Now, we've already kind of covered moderates and swing voters don't really exist anymore. It was a little more true when Clinton and Kerry were running. It's less true now about the moderates and swing voters. So it can be debated whether that strategy they used then or employed then was worthwhile, perhaps, perhaps not. Now, definitely not. But the overall idea here is that when we actually look at their ideology and their policy positions staked out in their platforms and what they said in their debates and what they said in their ads, they were consistent and they were the same. They didn't change. So there is a way that if we don't want to mobilize the opposition, you can stake out policies that your opposition won't be happy with, but the rhetoric that you use can be tempered so that they don't realize that you're stuck to your guns the entire time, so to speak. Oh, I should mention on this though, the research is very clear on this, that if you do actually change your policy position, so you're not punished for changing rhetoric, you are punished for changing policy. That's a terrible thing to do. Keep your policy, temper down your rhetoric if you feel like it. Let's go back to the Lucy McBath race. Her biggest issue that she ran on was
Gun violence.
guns. And that's like a Republican's worst nightmare. You know, don't take my guns. She stuck to her policy. I don't want to use the pun, she stuck to her guns. She stuck to her policy. But you said that you felt you had to be a little more moderate.
Well, I feel like she has to now, because she doesn't want to lose the seat, because it's always
All right, so let's go with that.
contested race.
Is she going to change her gun stance?
No.
Okay, this fits in exactly to what we're saying here. So she's got a policy, she's sticking with that policy, but the rhetoric needs to change a little bit about it. Now, if she were to actually change her policy, the Republicans would hate her. Yeah, you could argue why she's no longer going to take their guns. No, it doesn't matter. They now have the aha, see? Like you can't trust her. She's always changing her mind. And the Democrats are going to do the exact same thing. We can't trust her because she breaks her promises. So do not change your policy. Do campaigns matter? Hey, we've been talking the whole time. You're all in here as candidates for campaigns. This is a serious question. We actually need to talk about this. Do you even need to run a campaign at all? I know that seems like a silly question, but it's not. People who interact with and what they believe depends on their social identity, such as race, gender, and political affiliation. The spread of information is within certain social groups. We create these echo chambers that further segregation and political polarization. And individuals seek out information that agrees with them, so we call this confirmation bias, and they reject information that they disagree with. The flow of information leads to the false perception of in-group majority. In other words, they think they're not alone, that all these other people agree with them because they're in that echo chamber and they keep hearing the same thing over and over again. So they're not wrong, they're right, this is the way it should be. So if people are that polarized, if they're that segregated, if they're that stuck in their beliefs, is there anything that it can't, like, why do you even campaign? They've already made up their minds, they're going to go do what they're going to do. Why put all this time, energy, and money into contact, just put your name on the ballot and be done with it? Right? I mean, that's a legit question. Do we have an answer for that? Anybody in the room, have you thought about that actually?
As the goal, to actually mobilize them to move past this idea that they think that everyone's just going to go out and vote for that candidate, so they don't need to go and do it. You have to show them that the majority is not actually what they think it is, and have them get out and go and vote.
So you're half correct. The whole part about mobilization, that's the big key here. And so that's what we're going to be looking at next. So the question was, what can your campaign do? This is why you campaign, right? So that you can give voters cues about your partisan identity, policy position, facts, just what he said right there, actually. Like, just tell them, like, no, this is the truth. This is what things really are. We don't have healthcare in the United States, it's terrible, but we have a plan to fix that. You should be voting for us. Well, it's complicated. There is growing evidence from many rigorous studies that campaigns actually have zero persuasion effect. This is key because we're talking about persuasion here. There are some things we call the fundamentals, like the state of the economy, distribution of partisans in the electorate, and ideological locations of the candidates, where they are in the spectrum, how progressive or moderate they are, that we can actually use to predict most campaigns, like the outcomes of the elections. In fact, models using just these fundamental conditions are actually more accurate at predicting the election results of a race than polls throughout the race. So we're going to take a quick stop right here, stretch your legs, get a drink, use the restroom, ask a question, whatever you need to do, and we'll pick back up. Because now we're actually going to start to get into the nuts and bolts, details, numbers, cost, the Hustle app, where you can even get phone numbers to begin with, things like that. Okay, so there was a good question, which I want to go ahead and start off with. It doesn't pertain necessarily to this slide, but it is a very good question that might be on your minds. So what about the whole Obama to Trump switching? You know, can we win those individuals back? Because we do know that there were voters in 12 who voted for Obama, and in 16, they switched over and voted for Trump, those traitors. They are not worth going after for a couple of reasons. Yeah. It did catch some experts and academics by surprise, and you know, why is that? And there's always kind of a lag between like when an event occurs and in the study and then the results of that. But in the last 2 years, we've had some stuff really come out shedding some light on that specific group of individuals. And there's two things. One, it was not the economy. And two, it was more sexism and racism. So here's the thing. An individual's religion and political affiliation is usually something that they get from their family, right? Like if you grow up Christian or Muslim or Jewish, you get it because you're in a Jewish family. Well, same thing's true with being a Democrat or Republican. There were 3 major times in the 30s, 60s, and 80s where there were giant shifts in the parties and voters. There was a realignment. And actually, one of my sources coming up here is from Alan Abramowitz, who's a political science professor at Emory. And the realignment is basically all he does is study that. Yes, people have been slowly shifting. These Obama to Trump voters, it's possible that they could have been relics of this, but more of what it is, okay, we gave the black guy a chance. Racism has defeated everyone. We had a black president. And then Trump comes along and is the only candidate dumb enough to actually speak his mind openly, and they like what they hear. They were that way to begin with. So you're not going to win them over because they are who they are, and Trump just appealed to that and kind of woke them up. And so they voted for Trump. They're not going to come back from that. Okay, if people live in their own little bubbles, you can't persuade them on issues or facts. The difference between persuasion and mobilization is getting them to vote in the first place. Persuasion is once they're there, casting their vote for you. So that's the difference. If you can't win over Republicans, independent swing voters are a myth, and you can predict election results based off of a list of factors we covered, like the economy and the partisan makeup in your district, you know, gerrymandering, whatever. So why run a campaign at all? We need to talk about when campaigns are successful in order for you to understand why you need to campaign. Campaigns are more successful when cues such as party identification or prior information about candidates and issues are scarce. Think of nonpartisan races. Think of Board of Education races, commission races. Campaigns make a huge difference there because voters don't know what's going on. They matter less in like presidential campaigns or like when Stacey Abrams was running for governor, because there's a ton of information out there. Politics is on everybody's mind. They are very familiar with it. They always vote for the presidential elections. It's just what they do. The campaigns have a smaller effect there. That's not to say that they don't have any effect. We're talking about the magnitude of that effect. Your campaign matters more the smaller the race is and the less information those voters have about the issues in that race. So let's say like a SPLOST 2020 is going to happen here in Clarke. Campaigns for or against SPLOST could have a huge impact there because of how little information the public has about those issues. Campaigns do matter at the margins. Now, what do I mean by this? Let me back up here. If you just put your name on the ballot, which they've actually done in some experiments, they just put a fake name on a ballot, that name actually gets a certain percentage of votes without anything being done at all. People will just look for the party identification and will vote for that person. When we say campaigns matter at the margin, how much up or down does your campaign actually move that result? Campaigns are necessary for the fundamentals, the issues that are out there to be realized. You need to enlighten low information voters. This is particularly important in a general, less so in a primary, because the really informed voters tend to be primary voters. The low information voters tend to come out in the general. So an examination of Obama's 2008 election showed the responses to the fundamentals. So this is the state of the economy. This is where Obama was at on the ideological spectrum. This is where partisans were spread out in the different districts. You could actually explain 80% of his election results just off of those few things right there. But 80% isn't 100. When you actually took in his campaign messages and his contacts with voters, then it helped explain 94% of the election results. So in other words, his campaign did have a marginal effect on the outcome. This is an example of successful clarifying campaign because the candidate makes voters more aware of the issues and this candidate's relationship to them. This is what I stand for, this is what I believe, and this is what I'm going to do, and this is why it's important to you. Campaigns can increase voter turnout by mobilizing voters. And this is the single biggest thing that campaigns can do. In fact, I argue it's really the only thing your campaign should be doing is mobilizing voters because of how important that is. Your campaign is going to make a marginal difference to the election results. And most of that difference is going to come from getting people to vote in the first place. So the question is not whether campaigns matter, it's where, when, what, and for whom they matter. Is it a primary? Is it a general? Is this a low information race? Are there partisan cues? Are people aware of the issues that have come up? Between 2006 and 2012, 89% of Americans were in a highly competitive jurisdiction for at least one office. I point this out because, believe it or not, most races in America on a ballot, most people in America will encounter competitive races where their vote does make a difference. Maybe it wasn't the presidential race, maybe it wasn't their local commission race, maybe it was just the Board of Education, or maybe it was just like the insurance commissioner. There is a competitive race on that ballot for 9 out of 10 people in America. While individual elections are often uncompetitive, so again, I'm going to use I know that there might be some candidates or campaign operatives for some of these races, but this is a good example. Let's say the 10th Congressional race here in Georgia. The 10th Congressional race historically is very, very conservative and has not been competitive. I think a 30% gap between the Democrat and the Republican is a pretty significant gap. But that doesn't mean that you still shouldn't have Democratic campaigns in the 10th Congressional District for a couple reasons. One, while more Americans witness competition in America than other places like Canada, the UK, or other nations with the plurality system, there is a lot of evidence that your campaign, even if your race isn't competitive, your race can affect the outcomes of other Democrats on that ballot. So your race may not be competitive, but your campaign can still help the party. So I guess what it comes down to is, are you concerned about the greater good? If so, you need to campaign. And even if you know that you may not win, it is imperative for the other voters and the other candidates that are on that ballot that you still go out and do your best and try to mobilize voters, because it will affect some of the other more competitive races on that ballot. So a word of caution for campaigns, though. The larger the campaign, this is a general rule, the larger the campaign, and if they are an incumbent, they're much more accurate at knowing what their chances, what their odds are. The lower level races, Board of Education, Commission, smaller mayoral, they're not very good at predicting how well they're going to win or lose. This is important because it kind of changes the way people go at a race, like the tactics that they employ. Some people may feel safe, and maybe they're not, and there were a couple things they could have done and they didn't because they felt safe. While the public may be better served by politicians fearing defeat, by this we mean politicians who feel they need to be responsible. If they fear defeat, they're going to be more responsive to the electorate, which goes back to the whole beginning thing, like what we think they should do. Campaigns are typically staffed by workers who are overconfident. Yeah, man, we're going to win this thing. That's great. You want that confidence. But relying on those individuals as your consultants and as your comrades to like kind of discuss things, shoot ideas back and forth, overconfidence can be a negative as well. Your campaign needs to be self-reflective and be like aware of, okay, where do we really sit? How are we really doing? Is the tactic that we've employed here in this precinct accomplishing what we want it to accomplish? Lower office campaigns are not very good at accurately assessing their chances and can take things for granted and end up surprised when they're defeated. What? We lost? How did that happen? I'm sure that probably doesn't surprise you, but I thought I'd point it out anyway. Sometimes, I guess this goes in the category of no shit science, but sometimes it's good to verify some of these things, even if we've been thinking them for a while. There are two exceptions for persuasion. In general elections, early persuasion rapidly decays, and late persuasion rarely appears. General elections tend to be low information elections. It is possible to actually persuade somebody. So let's go back to the more moderate Republican women in suburban Atlanta. If your campaign starts targeting them at the beginning of your campaign, I'm going to give you the timeline in just a little bit, but if you're targeting them at the beginning of when you should be out there with your ground game, and you are consistently hitting them early and often, it is possible to create some persuasion effects. When party cues are absent in a ballot, so it's a nonpartisan race, when you are reaching them far in advance of a general election, I don't know, primary, that's what I was looking for, primaries. The most important persuasion effect occurs in primaries. Now, if you think about this for a second, it makes total sense. So there are two Democrats running. Sir, what's your name?
Jack.
Jack. Okay, Jack and I are both Democrats. We are running for U.S. Senate. Okay, so we're both on the debate stage and we're going back and forth. And okay, but the truth is, to the primary voters out there, we're both on the same team, so which one do they really pick? Maybe they like something I say, maybe they like something he says. This is difficult, okay? Like, God, I don't want to make the wrong choice. This is where persuasion really comes into play in primaries. So mobilization is for the general, persuasion is for the primary. Now, direct mail effects and name recognition. Okay, so in a couple of these studies, like in this one, they actually examined like mid-August. This is for a general November election. In mid-August, how much mail did you get? Now, they sent out mail, and then they followed up with a survey to see how much mail individuals were getting. Mid-August, 39% of respondents had received political mail. And there were no lasting effects of the mail they received in mid-August. By mid-October, with about 6 weeks to go, that is where they had 80% of the respondents saying they got political mail. 8 out of 10 people were getting political mail by mid-August. That's also where they had the most name recognition effects. In the last last 2 weeks to the election, there was so much political message saturation. There were no effects of sending them any new mail. And everybody who was going to vote knew who they were going to vote for and were familiar with the candidates, basically. So there's no lasting effect too early. There's no lasting effect too late. You need to hit them about 6 weeks out to have the most effect. Now, I'm not saying that there's zero effect, but you're the most effective in that October range for a general election. Mailers, particularly positive mailers, that highlight a candidate's strengths and name, may be particularly useful in lower profile races. Board of Education, again, Commission, I keep pointing these out because those are the types of races where there's very little information. They're not getting talked about a lot, except for the people who really care about them, and that tends to be a very small group. Though mailers may be a useful tool, the rapid decay of their effect makes them far less than an ideal solution. Now, the smaller your race is, I would be doing as much door-to-door, personal, etc. The larger your race is, if you are a state senate or a congressional race, you're just not going to be able to knock on every door, so you need to rely more on things like mailers because you're trying to reach as many people as possible. Voting is an emotional act, so we're going to appeal to emotion, and imagery is where you start. I've got this lovely picture up here. Everybody's like, oh, she's adorable. I've created a positive impression in you, and you will like that and remember that more than what's on the slide. In fact, probably 24 hours from now, you will have no idea what this says, but you might actually remember her pretty face. Because it's important. Imagery lasts, emotion lasts more than logic does. Or it's recalled, let me reword this. Emotion is the first thing that your brain processes. It processes emotion before it processes logic and reasoning. How you craft your visuals is important. What people find aesthetically pleasing can actually be empirically measured. So, in other words, we can say with confidence what is likely to work on a large group of people. Doesn't mean everyone. There's always that, one or two outliers. But for most people, we can actually say with confidence what will work with them. For some of you who are in the smaller races, you may have to save money, do the work yourself. I mean, I'm guilty of it. Most of the work that my campaigns that I worked on put out, I did all the graphic design, the videos, stuff like that. If you're going to do that, you need to know how to craft that visual appeal. Now, if you can afford it, I would get graphic designers and production crews because they should know what they're doing. But if you need to save money, this is something you're going to have to be aware of. The rule of thirds is one of the most important compositional rules in visual imagery. It goes back about 200 years, 220 years. Here's what I mean. So this is the title slide I started with. The title slide is 2/3 blank space that I was able to put my message on, and the bottom 1/3 covered up with an image. That's what I mean by the rule of thirds. Humans actually find things that fit in nice and nice patterns, and things that are organized and structured. We like symmetry, and in this particular one, now instead of vertical, we're going horizontal. So we're kind of covering 2/3 with the image, and then the last third is for the message. Those are visually appealing ways to design your images. Simply changing the music or imagery of an ad without changing any of the actual content of the message can completely change the perception of the receivers. So I just created this real quick. Depression, don't let it hold you back. Depression, don't let it hold you back. Same exact content, but do I have anybody here who is brave enough to tell us what they think about these two images? Like, does one or the other, top or bottom, does it affect you differently? Do you think it would affect someone else differently? What do we think? Yeah, you raised your hand back there.
The top one seems a little more sinister. I mean, it looks a little less...
By a show of hands, how many feel that the top one kind of has a worse vibe to it? Thank you. I would have totally messed this up if no one raised their hand. Yes, thank you. That was the intent. So I wanted to invoke a darker, more sinister vibe. Those exact words right there. And you all seem to agree that, yes, that's what it did. But the content is the exact same. And I didn't do anything else except just use a picture of a woman. Well, I guess I take that back. That is a woman, but she's behind a chain link fence. Okay. Politically informed citizens are more easily manipulated. So politically informed citizens, the people who follow politics the most, are the most easily manipulated by emotional appeals. Positive enthusiasm ads are in fact more polarizing than fear ads. Now, what do I mean by polarizing? What I mean is that's who it activates. If you run an enthusiastic positive ad, so I'm a Democrat, I'm going to run an enthusiastic positive ad, that will appeal to my base. It will not appeal to my opposition. In fact, it's not really going to do much to my opposition. It's not going to mobilize them to vote against me. So it's polarizing. It only affected one group, my group. That's what I want it to do. Black and white video images are 10 times more likely to signal and appeal to fear or anger. So as Arlene pointed out, sinister, fear, anger. The emotional appeal triumphs over the logical appeal in nearly 3/4 of all political ads. Emotion matters more than the content. Reasoning doesn't matter. Make them personal. Studies have shown that the content of the message doesn't matter. None of the following made any noticeable difference in mailers or canvassing. Emphasizing closeness of the election, civic duty, ideology or policy, holding elected officials accountable. Hey, we need to hold them accountable for their vote on this bill, or it's your civic duty. Americans need to go out and vote. The election is just around the corner. that stuff didn't really have a huge effect on getting people to turn out. What did matter was how personable they were. For example, like canvassing, a face-to-face interaction with the individual. Social pressure, by the way, hey, by the way, we know what your voting record is, and you didn't vote in 16, so we hope you come out and vote in 2020. That is the single most effective way to mobilize people to vote. It's also the easiest way to make enemies of everybody. So seriously, we do know that social pressure, letting people know that their voting records are public, has a significant impact on the number of people that show up to vote. But they feel a lot worse about the whole process and the candidate and everything. So it works, it just makes them very upset with you.
Would you say canvassing is the most effective way to always turn out voters, in every race, like whether, it's really low turnout, like Watkins Mayor, or, really high turnout, like president?
Yeah, so that's a good question, because canvassing is used by all these different campaigns, and so one thing is, does it actually work? Should we be spending our time on something else? Yeah, canvassing actually here's the thing. The ratio of the number of contacts you have, the actual face-to-face contacts you have, to the increase in your vote share, you get an increase of one person for every 15 that you knock on the door and you talk to. Now this is an actual talk to, right? For a telephone call, it's like 1 per 35 people that you talk to. For literature drop, a mailer, it's like 1 for 282 or something. So there's some caveats here to this though, right? Because those numbers imply canvassing being the single most effective. Well, those odds, or that ratio, yes. But I can buy up a whole bunch of mailers. I can send out 20,000 mailers. It's going to be really difficult to knock on 20,000 doors and have 20,000 conversations. The smaller your race, the more applicable tactics like canvassing are, the more realistic they are. So if you can, for like a Watkinsville mayoral race, if you can knock on doors, you should focus on that before the mailers. Because another way to look at it is, let's say there's only 2,000 people. Well, if the success of a mailer is 1 per like 282, that means you're going to get what? An increase of like 10 people? Or I guess 100 people, if I can do math. So that would be 10 people. Yeah, 10 times 280, you're only going to get an increase of 10 people by sending out a mailer to just that very small group. But knocking on doors, if I can knock on 100 doors, 200 doors, 300 doors, I'll get more than that 10 people. So it depends on the race. It depends on the size. It depends on the manpower, the volunteers you have, and the money you have. If you can canvass, that's what you need to do. If you're in a larger race or you don't have the money or you just don't have the volunteers, you're going to have to rely on other things like maybe Facebook ads. You're going to have to rely on telephone calls, texting, things like that. So to answer your question, if you can do it, yes, canvass, but there are caveats as to when and whether that's the most effective. Canvassing does work the best. Now, I like this, and I'm just going to read what this political scientist has to say here. Wait a minute, if you start talking about this empathetic canvassing strategy in public, the other side might learn about it and try to copy it. And then what's the point? And the political scientist said, I smiled. What a thing it would be if Democrats and Republicans competed with one another over who could be the most caring neighbors. In the meantime, whichever side does it better, so we're talking about personable messages, face-to-face messages, whoever can do that better will be more likely to win the election contest. And that's just a truism that we find. So, canvassing is super important, and there's a mistake a lot of campaigns make with canvassing. And if you make these mistakes, then you've just defeated the whole purpose of canvassing. In fact, you may make it worse. For instance, if we actually look at 2012, the Obama race, and we look at door-to-door canvassing efforts, we found that the individuals, so the volunteers, the people who are going to go canvass, we found that when they were interacting with voters on the campaign's behalf, the voters were demographically unrepresentative. This is a huge no-no. You don't send a 60-year-old white lady to a younger black community to talk about issues. You don't send a 20-year-old college kid to a retirement home to talk about voting, right? Like it works much better. The receiver of the message is much more receptive when the person who's talking to them fits in with their social and political and demographic identities. They were ideologically extreme, so the canvassers were ideologically extreme. And this makes sense because the people who are most likely to volunteer for a campaign are the really kind of gung-ho, like, I am into this, I know what I'm talking about type thing. I'm going to use the ban the plastic bag as an example. I'm not saying that's not an important issue. It is. Banning plastic is an important issue. But the person who is really behind banning the bag, it probably is really important to them, but it may not be important to the person that they're talking to. And this really matters because now we're talking about sincerity. If the canvasser is, we need you to come out and vote because this candidate's going to do the right thing and ban the plastic bag, but the person you're talking to is really concerned about decent wages, getting out of that house that they live in that has mold in it, and getting child care, for their 2 kids or 3 kids, if those are their important issues, they're going to feel like you're not listening. And because you're not listening, whatever I'm going to hear from you, I'm not going to believe you. I'm not going to trust you. You need to make sure that when you're talking to somebody, you're actually listening to them and taking what they have to say important. It may not be what's important to you as the canvasser, necessarily your top priority, but you need to make it your top priority when you're talking with them. They also misunderstood the voters' priorities. So that goes with what I was just saying about the child care and the wages. The study questioned whether individuals typically willing to be volunteer surrogates are productive agents for a strategic campaign. In other words, you can't just take, hey, we are desperate for canvassers. Oh, thank goodness you're here to canvass. Okay, here's the stuff. Just go to these houses and send them off. That's probably the worst thing you can do. Canvassing is the most effective thing you can do, but only if it's done well. It does take time, it's labor intensive, to actually make sure that the people who are going to volunteer for you, that they are comfortable with this whole process. I mean, look, it's not easy to go door to door and talk to people and go over issues. It's not easy to sit there and potentially run the risk of running into somebody who doesn't agree with you. They've got to be comfortable. They've got to be safe. They've got to have some experience. The more experience somebody has, the better they are at just dealing with variation in the discussion. And be willing, you could say, okay, I got 2 canvassers, one's experienced, one's brand new. If I split them up, one this side of the street, one this side of the street, I can double my houses. That is true. Your experienced canvasser is going to increase your vote share. Your inexperienced canvasser is actually going to subtract from your vote share. And so then it's a net wash. You're better off matching up the experienced person with the inexperienced person so that they can just tag along and just hear what they have to say and how it's done. They don't have to say a thing. And you could say, well, that's a waste of those 3 hours for that person. No, because experience is valuable, and you can't get it any other way than doing it. And then, after 2-3 times of canvassing like that, now they can go out on their own, and you won't lose votes. Television ads, I don't know, again, what size race some of you are going to be in, but in the event that you're like, we should do a television ad, PBS or whatever, it's very small benefit, costly. It's most effective close to the election, as in like literally days, 2-3 days. Message decay is extremely rapid, and it disappears after 1 or 2 days. So it's really costly. It has a huge spike in the day that it comes out, and then it has a huge drop-off a day after that. The backfire effect. Corrections frequently fail to reduce misperceptions among the targeted ideological group. This is not just applicable to talking to Republicans. It's actually even more important talking to other Democrats. Whether you're in a debate, whether you're talking to constituents who come in to talk to your campaign, volunteers, donors. These are important members of the Democratic circles that you are going to be interacting with, and they're not all going to agree on things. And it's very, very tempting to be like, no, that's not true. Here, let me explain. But you're likely to create a backfire effect, which actually reinforces the wrong information. There's a whole science behind this. I'm not going to go into that, except for the fact that people have worldviews. Their belief systems tie into their identity. if you challenge them on their facts, you're challenging their identity. And that's hard for people to kind of deal with. Because if they have to rethink like the stuff they believe to be true, they may have to rethink who they are. And they don't want to do that. It's easier just to like dismiss you as being wrong. So trying to correct someone who has different beliefs than you only strengthens the previously held beliefs. Now, how do you correct misinformation then? Okay. So, one, is the information compatible with other things that that person believes to be true? So if you're going to present information to them, you need to make sure that that information fits with something that they think is also true. Tie them together. Is the information internally coherent? In other words, does it seem like it makes sense? Yeah, I get that. That makes sense. Does it come from a credible source? If they don't know you, even if you do the other things, unlikely to win them over. But if it comes from their teacher, their pastor, their soccer coach, whoever it is, they are more likely to believe the information. Do other people believe it? They don't want to be the only one. But if they see, like, if I'm sitting here trying to go over something with this young lady at the front and she's a little skeptical and I don't know about that, but other people in here are like, yeah, no, that's right, that's true. Now she's actually more likely to go, well, if they think it, it must be true. Keep it simple. Keep it simple. People don't do complicated well. There is nuance to everything. And we could sit here and really go over policy and this and that. The only time like nuance actually matters is in a primary. And that's to separate yourself from your primary opponent. Once you're in that general, keep it simple. Policy position and what you're going to do. Like, how are you going to pay for this? How are you going to fix climate change? None of that actually matters. And the only people who are going to ask you are the diehards who are going to vote anyway. So keep it simple. Now, this is more for like when I share it and you want to look at this. Just some different strategies like the problem, continued influence, the backfire effect, the worldviews, and then some actions you can take to kind of work with that. The biggest thing about worldview, and this is the number one problem, a person's got a worldview and your information, your campaign message isn't meshing with their worldview. The biggest thing is what you're really doing is they're having an internal conflict with their identity. And you need to help affirm that identity so that they can feel like, okay, I personally am not being challenged. I personally am not wrong. Okay, I can accept this new information now. And that's the biggest task that your campaign will have with your messages. Message decay. The immediate effects of advertising are larger in subnational. So in the smaller races, advertising has a larger effect than in the larger races. And the message lasts longer in the smaller races. Messaging is more important for down ballot races, and it's crucial that the message reach the intended audience within less than 6 weeks before the desired action. So if we're talking about you need to register to vote, you need to do that in this 6-week window before they need to register. When you're talking about early voting and the end of, like early voting is going to start and then early voting is going to end, you need to be reaching them like the week before that happens. Message decay is very rapid. So starting to go out and like it's May, June and trying to canvass and talk to people is a complete waste of time and money and energy. Don't do it. What about absentee ballots by mail? Now, this has actually been a new thing. Maybe some of you have kind of seen some of this, but there's been some push to like increase absentee ballots by mail or vote by mail. It is actually true. You can get people to vote by mail. But it doesn't have any effect on increasing turnout. What it does do is just shift votes from in-person to mail. So it's the same overall number of votes, you've just shifted how they vote. There are, though, reasons why this may be an acceptable thing for your campaign to do. Maybe you fear closure or reduction in polling locations. Or maybe last election cycle there were 6 and now this time there's only 2 polling locations. And there are legitimate concerns that the distance people would have to go to the polling locations or the lines there would be enough that people aren't going to vote. And if that's the case, you really want to push the absentee mail. It's not going to win you any more votes, but at least you won't lose votes from people who don't show up who otherwise would have. What about political participation online? Well, we've all seen the internet warriors. Actually, it turns out being active online does have an effect. Online activities have mobilizing effects, and this relationship appears to work largely in a stepwise or spillover manner. Again, we're talking about social networks. People who go on forums and talk about things and who are politically active online, it actually will end up resulting in them affecting their close social networks. Lower intensity activities like just simply checking out a story or news, political news, will eventually lead, or is likely to lead, to larger participation. And by this, we mean even going on to Facebook and checking out comments or political stories will be the first step to them potentially volunteering and canvassing and voting. So yes, political participation can be affected by internet activity. Social networks affect political behavior. Individuals with larger social networks are more likely to be engaged and are more likely to both influence and be influenced by others. If your campaign, and this works better for smaller campaigns because you're able to kind of do this micro-targeting than larger campaigns, but if you're able to actually identify individuals with large social networks, influencers or whoever they are, if you can target them and win them over, kind of like with the marriage and the household and the spillover, you don't have to talk to 50 people. You can just talk to this one person and have an effect on 50 people because of their social network. Your campaign wants to find these people with the large social networks, get those individuals to like your stuff, share your stuff, talk about you, be on your side, donate, say they donate, whatever the case is, because that activity and engagement is going to spill over into their social networks without you having to do it. Can Facebook ads increase voter turnout? Primarily when you can activate people's social networks, again, so social networks, you can have an effect on them. People need to be exposed to issues and be engaged. If they're not liking, sharing, or talking about it, your ads are worthless. Or I guess the scientific term is have no marginal effect. Do endorsements matter? This is important because I think a lot of candidates are like, I have to get that. I have to get the Planned Parenthood. I have to get, if you're a Republican, I got to have the NRA or whatever. Do endorsements matter? Most empirical studies of endorsements, especially celebrity, like, oh, I got Brad Pitt to endorse me. It doesn't do anything. There are exceptions, though, just like persuasion. Persuasion works in a primary, not in a general. So when do they matter? Low salience. Salience, we're talking about importance. How important is the race? For most people, Board of Education or Commission race or Insurance Commission race isn't that big a deal. There are disengaged voters. In primary, so endorsements matter when most people don't know about your race and when it's a primary when they can't distinguish between the candidates up there because they're all Democrats. Can significantly affect vote share and evidence from congressional candidates. It can increase donations. So if you're running a primary race and you pick up a bunch of endorsements, that is likely to increase your vote share in the primary and the donations you receive as a result.
I just wanted to bring up, Taylor Swift actually back in 2018, remember she endorsed Phil Grandison, the Senate candidate for Democrats, and they said that there were thousands of new voter registrations the day after the tweet. And
so without being able to study that, I wouldn't be able to go into the causal reasons for that, but definitely I guess a correlation. Definitely.
with young voters.
Ballot initiatives like the SPLOST 2020, endorsements. So if Brad Pitt's vote yes, SPLOST 2020, it does have an impact. For self-identified liberals, endorsements tell the voter who to support. But in nonpartisan races, like if you're running for a commission race and you get Stacey Abrams to endorse you, guess what you've now done to the opposition? And before, the opposition may not have been mobilized to vote against you or to vote at all because they don't know who you are. But now that Stacey Abrams backs you, well, if Stacey Abrams backs you, I'm definitely going to make sure that the other person, whoever it is, gets my vote. So it's a double-edged sword, and it's something you need to think about. If you're running a nonpartisan race, do you think that the endorsement is going to bring out more voters to your cause, or is it going to bring out more voters against you? Hard to say. That comes down to your campaign and who the endorser is. Information for voters in local nonpartisan races is often scarce. Studies indicate that voters may not treat political party and newspaper endorsements as signals of candidates' ideological positions. but rather as signals of partisan affinity or viability. So really all an endorsement is going to do, especially in nonpartisan races and in primaries, it's just going to help give the voters cues as to whether they think you're going to win and what side you really are on. What about race and endorsements? So we're actually talking about white, black, Latino, Asian. Turns out that black and Latino voters support co-ethnic candidates at higher rates in local elections. So black voters are more likely to turn out to vote for black candidates. Same thing with Latinos. Endorsements from black and Latino leaders and organizations increase support of out-group candidates. So here's what I mean by this. I'm a white candidate, Avery. I'm running in a district that's 68% black. I know that if I were a black candidate, I might anticipate a larger vote share, but I'm not black, I'm white. So I go to some local black church leaders and they go, yeah, we like what you have to say, we'll support you. And then I get them to publicly endorse me. Now I can anticipate a larger vote share. So that's my example, white candidate. Okay. But it's not the same if I went into a Latino community and I got Latino community leaders to endorse me. We don't really see an increase in vote share. And that's because the Latino community is a lot more separated on a few different things than, generally speaking, the black community. Plus, there is, academically speaking, more of a history of kind of a unified black community through the church, and they particularly listen to black leaders in the church. So in sum, black endorsements of out-group candidates are persuasive for blacks, but not for Latinos. What tactics are most effective? Okay, now we're going to get to the actual meat of this. Encouragements to vote, like, hey, thank you for voting. You know, you've been a great voter. You have a great history of voting. That can work and works well when delivered in person. Advocacy messages that give voters reason to support or oppose a candidate do not increase. So if your message is like, hey, support Avery because this, and this, that's going to have no effect. Messages that forcefully assert the social norm of civic participation are often highly effective at stimulating turnout in low importance elections, Board of Education, Commission. So, hey, I know it's not a huge race, it's not the presidential race, but every race matters. If you're going to vote for the president, you should also vote for your commissioner. In those particular situations, that can be effective at getting people to vote. Canvassing is the most effective, and phone calls that are chatty and friendly can also work. Mobilizing campaigns have downstream effects. This is super important because even if your race doesn't win, the effects of your mobilizing efforts actually can be seen in the next few election cycles. It has a downstream effect. So again, if you are concerned about the greater good and about the health of our democracy, your campaign, even in a losing race, can affect future races in those precincts. Showing appreciation and gratitude. Thanks for being a great voter. Those work. What about yard signs? We see them all the time. Obama and Biden, Stacey Abrams. The short answer is they're costly, low return, and at most studies have shown like maybe up to 2% or less in effect. The longer answer is it does help in small races, nonpartisan races, because this is where they need cues, they need signals. It helps with name recognition. The truth is most people who put up yard signs are doing it because they want to publicly display which team they're on. They do it because of traditions, the way it's always been done, and anecdotal evidence. Well, you know, the last race I was in, we used a whole bunch of yard signs, and we won that race, therefore yard signs win. Facebook to target the 30-plus crowd, YouTube for the under 30 crowd. By a significant margin here, YouTube is used by a significant portion of the youth, and Facebook is used as the #1 social media platform for adults. So if you're going to use social media, Facebook and YouTube are where you want to go. 74%, and this is sad I guess, 74% of US adults visit Facebook at least once per day. And it's the main source of news for adults using social media, again, by a significant margin. So over here, Facebook is the significant source of where people get their news and information from. I wouldn't bother with Instagram or Twitter. It's not used by a wide audience. Facebook does affect political behavior, shows that information we see in our social media news feed impacts the issues we perceive to be important. So, in a low information contest, if you are a board of education or commission or a mayoral, running Facebook ads and hammering home repetition of certain issues can actually get people to go, well, I guess that's an important issue. I've seen it like 13 times today, so it must be important. Political content on Facebook has the strongest effect on voters in low salience. So again, these things, the races that we don't normally consider important. You can shape what people think are important issues, and we call this agenda setting. Just real quick, because we're almost done here. Newspapers, radios, TVs, not worth the investment. Nationally speaking, more Republicans get their news from TV, and Democrats get it from the internet. So what platform you use does matter. If you're going to try and reach your base, you need to be using the correct platform. The internet, social media, Facebook is one of the best ways to do that. Okay, what about texting? Texting is great for the younger crowd. They're more receptive, but it works for everybody in general. Texting is legal if the user is sending the message and they're not automated. Automated is against the law, but actual physical sending the message is completely legal. Apps like Hustle allow the user to create a script. So you create a script and then you upload a list, let's say like 10,000 names, and it populates that message with the script you put in, but it will not send it. You have to physically press send, so it's not automated. The message goes through the Hustle app, so it's not your phone. You could put the app on your phone here, and you don't have to worry about the receiver seeing your phone number. Well, if I want to send it to 25,000 people, I don't want 25,000 people messaging, like having my phone number. The Hustle app, it anonymizes the number that the receiver gets. People receiving messages can reply back to the user, and you can have communications with them. So you can send out 1,000 text messages, get 100 replies, and actually talk to those people. One user is capable of sending out thousands of text messages in a day. In one of the last campaigns I was on, we had one lady who, in one weekend, sent 8,000 texts by herself. She was almost as proficient, or she was almost as good as my daughter. But what I will say, though, is you don't really want to put out more text than you can handle possible replies. So the key thing here is if you're going to send out 1,000 text messages, you need to anticipate 10 to 20% responding, maybe. So I think probably 4 to 10 is probably a better number. But 10% of 1,000 is 100 replies. Are you prepared to handle 100 replies? So if you can divvy up that 1,000, let's say break it down into 200 over 5 volunteers, much more manageable. Example cost. Accurate Append is a company in California. You can go to them to acquire phone numbers because if you use like Vote Builder, the information is terrible and not accurate. So the cost here is like 10 cents per price match with a 300 minimum. So an example, let's say I send them a list of 13,552 names. They have about a 45% match rate, so I'll get back about 6,098 phone numbers. Anyway, it ends up cost me $949, so about $1,000 to get 6,100 numbers. Hustle, that app, you then upload that list of your 6,100 numbers. You upload it into Hustle, peer-to-peer text messaging service. 10 cents per uploaded cell number, which is a one-time fee. You receive an invoice at the beginning of the month. So in this particular case, if I'm going to give them, let's say, 8,100 cell phone numbers, it'll cost me $810 one-time fee. So in this particular example, it's going to cost me a little shy of $2,000 to get about 6,000 to 8,000 numbers that I can text. Campaign tactic breakdown. Mobilization is better than persuasion. That's what your focus should be. Canvassing is the single most effective, but it needs to be face-to-face, personable, and the message doesn't matter. You can literally talk about how cute their dog is, how great the painting on their house is. The positive association, when you leave, that positive feeling they have is actually the only thing that matters. High return per number contacted, but it's extremely labor intensive and it's very slow, and the overall effect is a low number reached in total. Text messaging has about an 8 to 18% response rate, and it works better days before an action. So when we say an action, we mean do they need to register to vote? Does early voting start? Does early voting end? You need to reach them with your text messages in the 2 or 3 days before those things need to occur. Phone calls can work, but they need to be personable, chatty and friendly, and not too long. Direct mail works with caveats. It can help with name recognition, helps with low salience, so again, low importance turnout. Counts as voter contact, but it has a very rapid message decay, just like TV. Larger size is better, like physically the larger size of the mailer. The larger the mailer, the better. Most mailers go into the trash, but they pull it out of the mail, and as they're walking to the trash, it stands out. If it's small, it gets hidden in there and it goes straight into the bucket. But seriously, we actually do know that there is an effect on the individual when they take it out and it's got this giant thing and they're like, geez, look at this like elephant here. But they're going to look at it, and right before they put it in the trash, the visual imagery, this is why the imagery matters. They're not going to be reading all the stuff you put on there. You need to invoke an emotion, signal your party cue, and make that positive association in the 3 seconds you have going from, yep, well. But even in that, in those 3 seconds, it can still have an effect. That's why you need it to be larger and have it be more visual and have it be more emotional. It does have a low return per number sent. It's cheap-ish. So the example here, let's say you want to send out 5,000. Well, 6x11s, okay, as an example, are going to cost you $600 to print and about $12.50 for the postage. So it's going to cost you $1,800 for 5,000. Now, we said earlier that's going to cost you about $1,800-ish for like 6,000 to 8,000 text messages. And once you have those text messages, you can keep sending, text messages. So it's about almost the same initial cost for almost the same initial number, but you're going to have to pay that each time you want to send out a mailer. Campaign rallies really only work on the hardcore. Radio, TV, newspaper, magazine are ineffective. Smaller campaigns should invest their time in personal contact, such as door-to-door, try and do as much of that as possible. It's just not reasonable to expect that of larger campaigns. So larger campaigns should still try to do as much canvassing as possible, but really you need to reach as many people as possible to try and mobilize them. So this is where you're going to employ more tactics like texting, phone calls, mailers. Does the person who raises the most money usually win? Well, yes, but the causal mechanism is not necessarily money, because viability or the perception of the person winning leads to more donations, which in turn leads to higher levels of that person being perceived as winning. So it's endogenous. Now, a truly charismatic or great candidate can actually break this cycle, so there are caveats to it. But overall, yes, it's very important that your financial disclosures, your campaign disclosures, show you with as much money as possible raised. Doesn't mean you have to spend it all, but just getting money, especially more than your opponent, actually increases the future donations you'll receive and the support that you'll have. Real quick, this is just, hey, this is you, you're the candidate. These are different social groups of people. It turns out that contrary to appearances, most donations don't come from corporations, they actually come from individuals. And if you just straight up ask them, hey, can you chip in $25? My campaign needs you, I gotta buy a t-shirt for my volunteer, $25, what do you say? If you just straight up ask them, they're actually more likely to donate to you. A person exposed to a single donor, and by exposed, I mean like you know of somebody who's donated. Once you know that somebody else has donated, you are now more likely to donate yourself. So, yay for meet and greets. Exposure to a single donor community. So, being exposed to somebody in your community who has donated increases the odds that you will donate. And ironically, being exposed to people that you know in your close social network, yes, that'll increase the odds you donate. But being exposed to people you don't know, who are strangers, increases the odds they will donate even more. So if you're going to put together a meet and greet for your candidate, or if you are the candidate for yourself, try to bring in as many people who don't know each other as possible to increase the odds that they donate and how much they donate. Now, when Republicans find out that there are people they know who are donating to Democrats, they feel like, well, I'm not going to let that Democrat, win. So they actually start to increase their donations to Republicans as well. You want to activate donors from as many different social groups as possible so that you can increase the overall number of people who donate. What about gender and donations? Man, woman, how does the money play there?
So going back to when you were talking about, I'm sorry for the word where you basically someone kind of public comes out and support. What's the word for that? I'm sorry.
Oh, endorsement?
Endorsement, yeah. How does the endorsement affect that type of likelihood to donate? Because it's that same type of thing with networks and stuff.
Yeah, so going back, there were some caveats there, like in the nonpartisan races and in primaries. Actually, endorsements there can increase the likelihood of donations. So a candidate's ideological view is very important to contributors. Where do you sit on the ideological spectrum? Donors want to know, because donors are only going to give money to kind of like-minded individuals, or people they think at least will support their cause. But donors, particularly Democrats, they have a gender affinity here. And I point this out because this kind of goes against perhaps common sense. We might think that Democrats are all about equality, but it turns out that if you are a Democratic candidate, you're treated differently based on your gender, more than Republicans, men and women. So men will give more to male Democratic candidates, and women will give more to Democratic female candidates. Female Democratic donors value the election of women, especially liberal women, more than traditional predictors, such as are they an incumbent and competitiveness? How much viability do we think they have? Democratic women will support them way more than men will, or that the effect that Republican donors are thinking about their candidates. Republican men and women donors do not focus on the gender of the Republican candidate as much. And female Republican donors prefer just simply more conservative candidates. So, if you are a male candidate, it helps you to be targeting male donors, and if you're a female Democratic candidate, it helps you to target female donors. And in fact, as a female Democratic candidate, you can actually enjoy a little bit more support from your donor base than a male in a more uncompetitive district. So, the existing partisan donor pools are friendlier to the emergence of liberal female Democrats. What about gender and stereotypes? Unfortunately, studies show that Democratic women, more than Republican women, are punished by voters for not sticking to gender stereotypes and norms. Again, I guess Democrats are supposed to be the party of equality and the party of tolerance, but that's not what we see in election results at the polls. We actually see that Democratic voters, especially like in primaries, they will punish their Democratic female candidate for not adhering to very gendered visuals. Here's what I mean by that. Wearing power suits, having shoulder pads, using masculine language and gestures. The Democratic voters punish those women at the polls, and we don't see that happen in Republican elections. So feminine and masculine images will affect how voters form opinions of the issue of competency of candidates as well as the perception of viability. So image matters. If you're going to be a female candidate, you need to be, I wouldn't say like go all out, but you want to shy away from using masculine visuals. And I guess that's probably why I put up Hillary here. She was known for her power suits. And there was, unfortunately, while it's not fair, she was probably punished by sexism. So what about public speaking? Studies show that aggressive speakers are seen as less credible. This actually applies to Bernie Sanders. He's an aggressive speaker. He has his base for sure, but there are those who see him as a very aggressive speaker and is less credible. And too much movement, and I'm guilty of that, I'm up here moving, but too much movement. I'm not the candidate, I'm not at a forum, and I'm not behind a podium. But too much movement away from the podium and whatnot, it does give the perception of they're dominant up there. Yes, they're confident. But for some reason, it also makes people think they're less trustworthy. So physical movement and gestures matter. They're natural, they're human, and people want to see you're not a stick figure. But it's about making sure you don't go too extreme and are just out there on the debate stage and you know what, let me just come down and sit right down here with you all, and people are like, oh, yeah, okay, that's enough for me. People use simple cues to make simple social categorizations. Now, what does a good timeline look like? We are right here at the tail end of this. When you announce your campaign, all you want to do is fundraise. Seriously, that's all you want to do. You do not need to be knocking on doors when you announce your candidacy. You do not need to be in August of 2019 knocking on doors or sending out mailers or attending political rallies for a November 2020. That is way too early. Seriously, 90 days, that's the only thing that matters. Really, 90 days. 90 days, that's when your ground game should begin. That's when you're canvassing, direct mail, personal contacts, targeting voters that need more personal contact. So the less likely that voters are to show up, the more contacts they need and the more time you need to give them. That's why you need to be hitting them out here. Retargeting these low salience and low turnout voters. Again, if it's a Board of Education, a commission race that people don't see as important, you need to be going back to those individuals. 6 weeks left. If this were general, this would be October. Most return on name recognition efforts and persuasion, if you're going to have, so if it's a primary, 6 weeks before the primary race is where you're going to have the most effect on persuasion. Message decays rapidly, so days before early voting starts, you need to message them, hey, be sure to early vote. And days before it ends, hey, last day to vote is this Friday, make sure you show up. Election day, so the last week to two, really, there's so much saturation. They know who they're going to vote for. They're tired of the political messages. They just want it all to end. There's not a lot you're going to do. I mean, we call this diminishing returns. Your effort's going to have diminishing returns. Honestly, the truth is a campaign could probably just call it quits at 2 weeks before election, but that looks bad, so you have to kind of continue your campaign. But I'm just telling you the efficacy of your work. The efficacy of your work really reaches its zenith, its plateau, with 2 weeks to go. So this whole time, you want to be targeting your low information, low turnout voters. It's really only that 6 week period that you want to be targeting your high information, high turnout voters. They don't need as much time, they don't need as many contacts. You may need 4, 5, 6 to 9 contacts on the same low information person, whereas you may only need 1 to 3 contacts with the high information. The contact, I mean, you knock on a door, you send them a mailer, and you send them a text message. Those are 3 contacts. The low information voter, you may need to send them 2, 3 mailers, 2 text messages, knock on their door 2 or 3 times. Those are contacts. This book is in its 4th edition, just came out in August by Green and Gerber, Yale professors. They go over really a whole bunch of specific tactics and look at the research on those, what works, when they work. If you're going to get a book, a single book, this is the one I would recommend. There's more to cover and a lot of nuance to a lot of the things that we've discussed. But the important thing is no matter how great your campaign or how awesome, intelligent, charismatic your candidate is, because I know you're all looking at me right now thinking to yourself, well, gee, as handsome, suave, and charismatic as Avery is, why hasn't he run for office? And while I appreciate those comments, the truth of the matter is I tend to tell people that they are wrong an awful lot, and it turns out people don't like that. So, probably would not make a good candidate. There's just a few factors out of your control, and you need to recognize that. Whether you win or lose, it may have been to circumstances out of your control, and there's nothing you can do about it, and you shouldn't beat yourself up over it. And at the same time, if you do win, you shouldn't be like, I am the greatest politician ever, because it may not actually have had anything to do with you. You probably could have put anybody in there with a Democrat behind their name, and maybe they would have won. So just keep that in mind. So, last thing, because this is just going to sum up everything. You need to apply the research that we've gone over to your race. When you are targeting voters, when to target them, what message to use, and how to frame that message. Voters are locked to the party. You don't have to worry about being too extreme for your base. They're still going to vote for you. Mobilize voters for turnout. Don't focus too much on persuasion unless it's a primary. Possible to persuade, but you are going to need lots of time and it's a low return. And this is true even in a primary where you're trying to persuade. Moderates, independents, and undecideds don't really exist, so you don't really need to target them. You won't win over on issues. People are just too divided. Education is important, healthcare is important. And then this group is like, no, we need to focus on pulling our troops out of Syria. People are divided. You're not going to win them over on issues. You definitely are not going to win over Republicans, so just give up that dream. It needs to die in a fiery, just don't. 9 in 10 people are straight ticket voters, so they're going in there to vote for the top ticket, president, the governor, and you need to tie yourself to that train. Once it leaves the station, you want to be sure you're on it. Local politics influenced by the national politics, the president. Yes, the Democratic candidate, whoever that's going to be, is going to affect the race here in Georgia next year at your level. You just need to embrace it and go with it. Messaging should be emotional, not logical. It seems counterintuitive, but let me tell you what my policy positions are. They don't care, actually. They are moved to vote because they're either fearful if they're Republicans or they're enthusiastic because they're Democrats. Those are the two main emotions that cause people to show up. Stay positive. Do not go negative. Negativity hurts Democrats more than Republicans. Best voter contact is face-to-face and personable. So, canvassing. Campaigns have minor effects, but they still matter. You need to mobilize people to vote. And in low salience, low important races and low information races, you need to get out that information to the voter. The last 90 days are everything, and tactics and timeline will vary depending on who you're trying to target. Are they low information voters? Are they high turnout voters? Is this a primary? Is this a general? You need to specifically take those things into consideration in your timeline. So this is my contact. If you have any future questions, if you want to go into any specifics, if I did not cover Vote Builder Day because I did that in the last training and that's a whole session on its own. If you have questions about Vote Builder and how to target or who to target, you can send me a message and I'll help you out. Now at this time, it is 4:29, so I nailed it right on the dot, even with starting a little later. We've been sitting for a while. I acknowledge that. It's not easy to sit, for 2.5 hours. Please accept my apologies for that. However, you guys have been great, and I am willing to stay here for a little bit if you have any particular questions overall or for your race in general. So having said that, thank you all. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon, and I'll have a couple minutes, because I know we got to pack up here, but I'll have a couple minutes to answer questions. Lights, how do we turn on the lights?